Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Containers from the Couch. My name is Laconde Muila, or Luke, and I'm a developer advocate in the Amazon EKS team. And today I'm joined by a special guest and friend, Shimon from Datree, a fellow CNCF ambassador, and we're going to be talking about policy enforcement in Kubernetes. Shimon, how about you introduce yourself?
Hi everyone. Hi Luke. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. I love your channel. Thank you very much. I've learned a lot by viewing it. So my name is Shimon Toltz. I I breathe and live DevOps and technology, and my background is in platform engineering mostly. So I started fairly young. I installed my first Linux when I was 12 years old and fell in love with open source tooling. And as you said, I'm one of the CNCF heroes, CNCF ambassadors, and I'm an AWS hero. And I get to work a lot on the interchange between cloud native projects and also the AWS cloud and
Yep,
where they all join together. Another thing that I have is
excellent
that
stuff.
I have a fairly new YouTube channel that I've launched. It's called Shim on Ops, and I kicked it off with an upgrade tutorial for EKS, and gonna have a lot of different interviews and the workflow videos that I'm having. So be sure to subscribe and follow. And of course, I'm the CEO and
Right.
co-founder of Datree, which is we're going to talk a lot about the area that we specialize in, which is preventing misconfigurations in Kubernetes, and to talk about the whole world of policy enforcement and shift left approach for developers managing apps and all those great stuff.
Yep, absolutely. Great stuff. Well, I'm really excited to have you on this episode. And before we get into the tree and the solution, a good place to start is always by defining the problem and the space. Now, so there might be people who have tuned into this session and they are new to the concept of policy enforcement as a whole. So, how would you describe it and why is it important? Why should Kubernetes operators care, platform engineers, and perhaps application developers as well?
Yeah, so I don't know, 20 years ago, we did not have a policy enforcement, maybe in firewalls, there was like a
Right.
policy in firewalls, and you're like, are you allowed to open port 80 to the internet? We still
Right.
have that in VPCs, right? But
Yep.
I think that if we look at the modern software development and the era of containers and specifically Kubernetes, I think there is one major change, and that is that in the Kubernetes world and the cloud native world, infrastructure as code is not a nice to have thing. It's not a best practice. It's like it's the only way to do things. Like you literally cannot go and launch a container on Kubernetes. There's no UI. Like many people built it,
Right.
and maybe they've hacked some stuff, but the basic, like if you look at AWS, you can spin up an EC2 instance. Then another way to do it is have a cloud formation, have a Terraform, and so on. In Kubernetes, the natural way to do stuff is to create a Kubernetes YAML file or a Helm chart and
Yep.
apply it to your cluster. And what happens is that in that area, engineers become very much infrastructure as code aware. And all of a sudden, they make changes to infrastructure, infrastructure pieces that they did not use to touch before. Because if now everything runs on Kubernetes and we have a Helm chart defining the app, and they can change stuff in the values and in the chart, guess what? They can also change other stuff in this infrastructure as code file. So
Exactly.
so one of the main problems is like, how do I on the one hand prevent misconfigurations and educate my engineers to make the right thing, but on the other
Right.
hand, how do I balance that as a security leader, as a DevOps leader, to make sure that people are not crossing boundaries, are not allowing
Yeah.
privilege escalation, or that they're just pushing whatever they want.
Yep.
And one thing that I would love to share is that when we look at that space, we can look at what are the most common areas of issues around Kubernetes security. And before we
Yep.
dive deeper into policy enforcement and how to prevent them, maybe you can bring up my screen and I can share an interesting report that I found very, very interesting. It is the State of Kubernetes Security Report by Red Hat.
Yep.
And obviously a very credible source. And when you dive deeper and you look into the different findings from this report, you see that 53% of respondents have detected the misconfigurations in Kubernetes in the last 12 months. Now, if we look at the respondents in the survey, you see that in terms of what security incidents or issues they had, the majority of the issues is actually misconfigurations. It's not failed audit, it's not major vulnerability, it's actually we are causing our own problems to ourselves.
Right.
And that's it. We can bring it down. So I guess, look, did you get did you get exposed to that, like when working with YAMLs? I guess did you feel this challenge?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I like the way you put it, that we are the ones causing these problems. And something you touched on earlier as well is the fact that there's still, uh, in the bigger scheme of things, even outside of your platform team or your DevOps teams, there has to be adherence to internal policies or security policies. And it'll look different from team to team or company to company. But a common model would be you have a separate cloud security team, right? That will typically be responsible for the policies or certain rules that have to be adhered to by the different platform or engineering teams. And so all of a sudden, though, you've got your platform or DevOps team, and they've been empowered with infrastructure as code. But like you were saying, how do you control what actually can be created? And so there has to be this translation of pre-existing, and I think in most cases pre-existing policies, and translating that into the infrastructure as code space, because that is how you essentially translate rules, which were the guardrails and best practices for security adherence outside of the Kubernetes space, and now you're bringing it into the infrastructure as code space to make sure that even your Kubernetes clusters and your workloads still adhere to that.
Definitely, and one way to describe this is actually someone from AWS gave me this example. He told me, I feel like we're back in the wild west, and like the engineers are the cowboys, and then we have like the sheriffs. Or I and my co-founder, we think like there are two types of policing the engineers in that regard. There's like the sheriff, and there is the community police. So when I talk to companies, I often try to categorize them into one of the buckets. So you come in and you see, either they say, listen, we have like 15 Kubernetes clusters, and I try to tell the engineers to try as best as they can, and then they push all the changes, and I pray to God that we don't allow privilege escalation, that we have liveness and readiness probes, that we have memory limit, and so on. And they try to educate, which is great. I love educating. The other side of the spectrum, which I call the sheriff, and they go like, okay, we lock down production, and now all the different changes have to be reviewed by the centralized DevOps and security team. And that obviously is also not the best way, because on the one hand, you can review everything, but no DevOps engineer wants to be a YAML debugger for, Kubernetes YAMLs to see if they have memory limits. It's not really interesting. And it slows down the way you work, because then you have a problem where like your DevOps team, I have talks with companies and they go like, Shimon, I'm dead. Like, we can't do anything. We're outnumbered. The amount of requests just come in, and we're unable to fulfill the business need because we are slowing down the organization. But what if there was a middle ground? What if there was some, gatekeeper? What if there was a guardrail? Something that was the middle ground between the two. So
Exactly.
this is moving towards like the different solutions that companies try to implement.
Yep, absolutely. And you mentioned something that I think is really important. Let's talk about why this is crucial for scaling. For example, let's say there is a company, and maybe someone even tuning into this session right now, where they do have a centralized model where the platform team is responsible for reviewing all the infrastructure as code, which is going to create a bottleneck. So how does infrastructure as code, or more specifically policy as code, actually help with your company scaling in a more secure and safe approach, and provide security as enablement?
So I think that the recently also the topic of IDP, developer portals and
Yeah.
enabling the different teams, and you want to give them
Yep.
services and tools rather than provide a service for them and do stuff for them. So I think the initial
Right.
thing is to set some sort of a code, rules, you might say. You might think of it as
Yeah.
society. We have the rules, like you don't steal,
Yeah.
and you need to follow the rules. And at some different points, there are checkpoints that check that you actually don't steal. And then there's the police that actually go and investigate if someone steals, in a way, right? In an analogy.
Yeah.
But if we take it to our world, number one, you want to set the policy, and we'll talk about it in a moment. How do I decide which
Yep.
policy do I need? Like, what rules are good
Yep.
for me? Maybe I'm a HIPAA
Yep.
compliant organization, PCI DSS, SOC 2, and so on. Which rules apply to me?
Mm-hmm.
Second is, how
Right.
do I distribute the rules and make sure that the developers are actually following them? And we'll talk about it, like shift left approach. How can you run the
Yep.
tests before they reach production, and how can you test them in your computer, in your CI CD? And
Yep.
finally, admission controllers on the cluster. And
Yep.
finally, giving a command and control system for the centralized DevOps and security teams to modify the policy. Because guess what?
Yep.
It only starts when you define the first policy, and then the policy keeps evolving and evolving and evolving, and then
Right.
you need to have
Yep.
a scalable mechanism to adjust the policy for your needs.
Yep. Do you think that that's actually half the battle? The teams just need to get started
I
with
think
some
so.
kind of a policy.
I think so.
Yep.
I think that, just getting started and seeing where you are is a very important thing. And there are different solutions. Also, one of them is ours, which is also part of it open source. We can talk about it. But,
Yep.
run a cube bench, run a Datree test, run a
Yeah.
Tree test.
Yep.
Talking about all the vendors. It's okay. And
Yeah.
get to know where you stand. And then
Exactly.
go and work on improving that. So maybe we can talk
Right.
about the different types of solutions and how different companies solve them.
Yep, absolutely. And actually, just before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about admission control, and that's something that you also mentioned, because this is an out-the-box mechanism that Kubernetes does provide. So, can you chat a bit about standard admission controls and dynamic admission controls, and how teams can start making use of these? Because this might be that first step for some teams before they actually get to adopting a tool.
Cool. So an admission controller in Kubernetes is much like a hook in operating systems. So how does an antivirus work? Every time, let's say in Windows, and a file tries to execute an executable, the antivirus intercepts that, scans the exe file to check whether it is okay or not, and then it is telling the operating system whether to allow it to run or to deny it. So it is exactly the same thing. An admission controller in Kubernetes, there are two types of them. Actually, there's a third one, but we'll talk about this later. The two ones
Yep.
that are like now, that exist now, is we have a mutating webhook and a validating webhook. A validating webhook, what it will do, it will sit on the control plane, and you need to connect to this API via a service that is running in your Kubernetes cluster. And then every time that there is a change to workloads in your cluster, let's say I do a kubectl apply, then this admission controller validating webhook will intercept that. It will call the service that is actually listening on that and tell it, hey, this service account, this user is trying to run this service. Should I allow it or not? and then the service will actually check and decide whether we want to allow it or not, and give back the result. And
Yep.
later in our show, we will show a demo of how I'm trying to push an invalid configuration, and a validating webhook will
Yep.
block me and will not let me do that. The second type is a mutating webhook. In my opinion, I don't like using it. I think it's a anti-pattern for GitOps, because what it will do, you will try to run something, it will then call the server can actually modify
Modify
and
it.
mutate the configuration file and send the mutated configuration to Kubernetes, and then it will apply it for you. So for example, you might say, if developers do not put memory limit, so let's have a mutating webhook that will add a 4 gigabytes memory limit to any workload. But then, in my opinion, it's an anti-pattern,
Yep.
because your GitOps configuration files will not say that you have a memory limit, but your Kubernetes cluster will say that it has a memory limit. And then you're gonna have a mismatch, and I personally think it's not the best.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point to mention it either way. And for those that are wondering, so in the API request path, the mutation webhook would take place before the validation, because like Shimon is saying, a modification will take place and then it will be tested against the specific criteria to see whether it meets it. Otherwise, if you validate before you mutate, then that way you may be changing something that shouldn't be allowed and then persisting that to the state of the cluster. But I think that's a great point that you mentioned, especially in the context of a GitOps pattern, that it would go against the whole principle or the ethos of what GitOps is supposed to be, where you've got your source of truth, whether represented in a Git repo or a Helm repo, reflecting or rather your cluster reflecting exactly what you have in that source of truth.
I
Something else
would
that
say
I'd like us to have. Yeah.
maybe one use case that I can think of that I can live with is
Yeah.
maybe like an
Yeah. Can live
SOS
with. I
use
like that.
case that discovers keys, like plain text keys that are like transmitted to your
Yeah.
cluster, and then the mutation like deletes them or something. That's like, but again, that's like in my mind, it
Gets rid
should
of
be a
them.
case
Yeah.
scenario. That's
Yeah. We could rename it an elimination webhook. Nuke anything that we don't want to persist persist to the state.
Absolutely.
I like that. So policy enforcement is something that we can incorporate this at different stages of development and the operation life cycles. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's say teams are trying to adopt that, and they're trying to figure out, so should we start running this at runtime? Do we just run this in the supply chain, specifically in our CI/CD pipelines? Should it go as far back as when a developer just starts working, when they're working on a service and they're perhaps working with Helm charts or customize or raw manifests? Should they have some kind of Git hook running on their laptop? So let's talk about where policy enforcement can go in these different stages, and any advice you'd give to teams that are trying to figure this out.
Sure. So I would say, so first of all, let's start from like the ground zero. So first of all, you need to choose your policy language. So popular policy languages could be like Kyverno, Rego. We support Rego and JSON schema. Now there is also Cell, which is Common Expression Language, which we'll talk about this later.
Right. Yep.
There is CDAR, which is a new language released by AWS, which is also like a policy language, which maybe we could talk in another session. So first of all, you need to choose like the language that you want to use, and at the end of the day, it's like the different the language that you codify the rules in. Then you need to decide which rules you want to use. We'll talk about the different rules, but just for the example, let's say you want to make sure that, I don't know, all of your workloads have a memory limit. And then I believe in shift left, and also if I look at the EKS security best practices recommendations by AWS, maybe you can bring up my screen. I'll show it.
Absolutely.
There is a great resource. We can put it in the comment, in the description. So there is the EKS best practices guide, and this is the security
Yep.
one for compliance. And we can see that they recommend shift left. Shift left means trying to identify the issues before they occur, as much left as you can. So
Absolutely.
if you can have it as a pre-commit hook and run it on the developer's laptop, great. On the engineer's station, amazing. Policy as code is what we talked about, codifying the policy that you want. Secondly, is
Yep.
running it in CI/CD. An easy view for me to show you is from our system. So we show the different stages. So there is the CLI. For example, the tree has a CLI. Again, other solutions also have CLIs that you can install on your computer.
Yep.
The second stage is integrating with a CI/CD solution. So every time there is a change, the policy will run and identify the issues before they try to be pulled into production. And finally, there's the cluster, which is you install it on the cluster and you hook it as an admission controller. And
Yeah.
I think you should try to strive as much as you can to have it in all areas. But look, let's
Yep.
be for real. You're not gonna get a CLI installed on your 100 engineers laptop in a
Right.
reasonable amount of time, unless, I don't know, you have
Yep.
some control over their laptop and you can just shove it in. So my recommendation is to actually start from the cluster. And when you start from the
Yep.
cluster, you can actually start by scanning the current state of what you have. So there are many different built-in rules. For example, in the tree, we have policies like
Yep.
the NSA hardening guide, CIS benchmark, EKS security best practices, again, that are recommended by the AWS security book. So we actually took it and codified the different recommendations into policies.
Right.
And after you decide which policies you want, you can start by scanning your clusters. And after you scan the clusters and you understand how bad is your situation, you can start thinking
Right.
about remediation and prevention.
Yeah. Right. That's a really good strategy. I like that. I like that point. Teams should probably start off by first trying to figure out, where do I stand, right? What's the current posture or health status for our cluster, and then work from there as well. Because sometimes if you start from, let's apply these controls, and not to say that you can't do that or that you shouldn't do that, but you might be ignoring some really critical things that um, are already existing issues in your cluster. So why not, start from there, see where you stand, and then create controls for that, as opposed to starting off with rules that you might say, okay, we lean towards applying these. Rather start from, where do we stand, and building out from that, and trying to, I think that could even help you prioritize the most critical issues and working your way through that list. I like that.
Sure. So I can show it in a moment. Maybe I can give you a brief overview of how we do it at the tree, and then we can also talk
Yep.
about different open source ways of implementing that.
Yeah.
By the way, our solution is also like partially open source, and I'll explain what do I mean. So the tree consists of two parts. There is the scanner, and then there is the centralized policy management platform, which is the SaaS.
Yep.
So the scanner is, as you see, is very popular, 6,000 stars on GitHub. And the idea is to have a community around the scanner, and the scanner supports a JSON schema, which is, it is very simple. You can define policy rules with JSON, which, like, you don't need to learn it because you already know how to do it. And secondly, it is open source and it runs locally. So you know that when you actually perform a scan in your computer or in your CI/CD or on your
Yep.
production cluster in EKS, we do not
Right.
receive
Yep.
your data. So this open source goes to our SaaS, pulls your latest policy, evaluates it, runs the tests
Hmm.
locally, and then it only sends the metadata to the Datree cloud. So this is a very, very
Yep.
important part. And then, you know, let's say if you are
Yep.
migrating um, to a new Kubernetes cluster and you haven't used Kubernetes before, then you could take the approach of starting to enforce policies from the get-go. But I guess that most of our viewers already have some kind of a Kubernetes workloads running on them. So I suggest number one, you scan your cluster and get the status. So for example, with Datree, you go to app.datree.io, you get a cluster for free. Even if it has 1,000 nodes, it's okay. You go and click on add a cluster. It's just an Helm add and Helm install. And then we will scan your cluster. And this scan will show you the posture score of your cluster, and it will show you if you have any issues. So for example, in this case, I can see that preventing containers from escalating privileges is failing, and it is part of the NSA policy, EKS and CIS. So if I click on it, I can see which namespaces are incompliant and how many resources do I have in them. And then as Shimon, the DevOps, was trying to fix that, I'm gonna go like, okay, so what is going on here? So I can see, okay, so this workload is not compliant. So what is the fixed complexity? What is the
Great.
potential? Um, so in their default state, containers allow privilege escalation. So attackers may use this to manipulate the application and to gain permissions, um, more permissions than they should have. And then we try to make it as simple as possible. So how do you fix this? So this is actually how you do. You go and you allow privilege
Yep.
escalation, and you disallow and you set it to false. And this way you can actually go and mitigate this issue. So
Yep.
no matter if you choose, there is tools other than Datree, but number one, get your status. Number two, we have the cluster settings, and in our case, you can decide what happens on failure. So remember, we have an admission controller. It inspects every change that we make, and I can decide, and the default behavior is that when you start, it is on monitor. But let's show you how a block works. So if I go into my terminal and I show you this file, you see that it is incompliant. It has some misconfigurations. It's a Kubernetes YAML. And now we will see the admission controller in action. So I'm going to do kubectl apply. And as you can see, currently, I'm not using any command that had to be installed on my computer. It's just vanilla Kubernetes. And I'm
Yep.
trying to apply this to my cluster. And what will happen is that actually we got an error. Error creating this YAML, admission webhook, Datree, denied the request. And now we can see what is the problem. And it is saying that, for example, here, prevent containers from escalating privileges. And we see that missing key, allow privilege escalation, is not set to false. And we can see where and which line. And it really explains to us what is the problem and where it is and how we should fix it.
Yep. Shimon, sorry to cut you off there. So something I've noticed with Datree, which I think is so important, is there's an element of education in how you help operators solve the problem. You explain what the issue is, the implications of it, as well as how to solve it. Why do you think it's so important to explain the implications of the issue and getting into the details of that particular problem?
Yeah, so let me show how it works, and then maybe we can stop the share and I'll explain in detail. So you're totally right. So we also have the
Yep.
let's look at the shift left version. So we have the Datree CLI. If I do the tree test on the same file, so now it's like an engineer running it from their computer, or maybe a CI/CD running it. And you see,
Yep.
for every rule that is failing, we see that there is a how to fix. And actually, if I click on that, it will take me to the docs and it will tell me this rule is failing. Why is it failing? What am I supposed to do in order to fix it? It's like we work really hard to make it really simple. And like in this case, we explain you don't have a liveness probe, so you can have, is it
Yep.
liveness or what is this? Yeah, liveness probe. So you can have it one in HTTP check, you can have a TCP socket,
Yep.
and so on and so on. So we can stop sharing. So maybe we can take some time to talk about some battle testing this. So from my experience, just having the hammer solution, it doesn't work. Look, and companies that just try to lock everything
Yep.
down, put prevention, and that's it, game's over. If you don't educate the developers and you don't give them a way to actually go and fix the issues and understand what the problem is, it's not going to work. Because trust me, no one wants to be the engineer who took production down, or in most
Yeah.
cases, people just don't know that they're not supposed to run as non-root, that they're supposed to run as non-root, or that
Yep.
they're not supposed to. I'll tell you even more. People copy paste shit from the internet all the time, and they don't know what's in
Yep.
it, and just copy paste, and they push it into production, and they don't know, they're not aware of it. And
Right.
this is why also the EKS security best practices guide talks about it,
Yep.
and I really relate with it, is that it is very important to take the shift left approach. So yes, we're gonna put let's talk about other solutions than the tree. So for example, you can use Open Policy Agent Gatekeeper, which you install on your Kubernetes cluster, and it will do basically the same as the tree. The difference is that we provide built-in policies out of the box, and you don't need to manage the server that actually does
Yep.
all of those admission controllers. And we also help you manage multiple Kubernetes clusters with multiple policies, and multiple policies per namespace. And once you really get to use it, you see the complexity. But um, at the end of the day, once you install the solution on your cluster, you have to give a way for engineers to actually
Yep.
understand what is the problem and to find it before it reaches production. And I think that starting with CI/CD is the best, because CI/CD is still centralized enough for it to fail before production or staging or whatever, but it is centralized enough for us to
Yep.
add it there. I'll be frank with you, it is very, very hard to have all of the engineers installing the CLIs on their computer, or the, VS Code
Yep.
extensions and stuff like that. It is very hard.
Yep. Absolutely. It's difficult to monitor who knows how many engineers in a team. But like you said, if there's a central place where you can manage that, and trying to catch things before or as earlier as possible with the whole shift left concept, and using your deployment streams essentially, is a great and pivotal place where you can actually accomplish that. So just to track with what we've been saying so far. So a good starting point is find out your health status or where you stand by running a tool in your cluster to see what your current health score is. From there, determine the most critical issues, prioritize them, and then start to implement rules and controls in your deployment streams in the CI/CD stage so that you can catch those things early on as possible. Something that I really like about the education element as well, in how you help engineers address these particular issues, is the fact that the security domain within Kubernetes it's complex and it's vast. Not everyone is going to have the time to get into the details of what these issues are and their implications. And so you're essentially providing another layer of enablement for teams by showing them that page on how to fix, because in that how to fix page, you're going into the details of these are the issues, these are the implications, this is how to solve it. And you've saved them a lot of time, because otherwise, well, one, they didn't know about those issues, so they couldn't know how serious it is. But also you've saved them opening up several other clicks online to figure out these particular issues. So I think that that's a really strong element to have in there as well.
Absolutely. I think it goes both ways. So number one is understanding what policy is best for you. So I think that you can start by relying on,
Yep.
other organizations than the tree, like the CIS benchmark, like or like the NSA hardening guide, like NIST and the NSA is like,
Yep.
if it's good for the NSA, I guess it's good for you, and maybe it's too tough for you,
Yeah.
right? But you
Right.
can always enable and disable
Yep.
rules. Maybe we can go. So number one is using predefined policies, and we talked about that. Maybe I can share my screen and talk a little bit about the policy itself to give people an understanding of what do we mean. So, for example, we codified the
Absolutely.
NSA hardening guide. So you want to prevent containers from accessing host files by using high UIDs, because this will give you the access to other files. You want to make sure that they have read-only root file system, because then, let's say someone hacks your app, they can then write to the disk, and then if they can execute something, guess what? You're pwned, and they can run something from your
Right.
stuff. And prevent containers from accessing underlying hosts, escalating privileges, and we actually explain in every one of them what you're supposed to do and how to fix it. But okay, so I take some policies, I want to manage
Yep.
them, but let's say in the tree, see how we manage them. You can enable and disable them. But now you're gonna tell me, Shimon, are you kidding me? I'm using infrastructure as code to configure all of my infrastructure using code, and now I need to go into some dashboard and click some, some policies with buttons. It doesn't make any sense. And you're right. And this is why, if we look at the recommendations by by EKS, we go at regulatory compliance, we can see that one of the recommendations is policy as code. Policy can be taught by a
Yep.
set of governance, and they recommend it.
Right.
So we actually have policy as code. And so if you enable policy as code and you go, you see you cannot change the policy.
Yep.
And if we go into the policy, we can download it and we can look at how it looks like. So after you do the initial configuration and initial work with the policies, the next step is to manage your policy using GitOps, the same way you manage your Kubernetes. So in this case, we have policies and we have the identifier of the policy, and you can comment in or comment out any policy, and then using the tree publish command, you can push the policy into the centralized policy management engine. And this way, you can actually collaborate on your policy and not go and enable and disable it using UI, which is great for us as a company for onboarding, for people to understand that they can modify the policy. But we have customers like Fortune 500 customers, they don't click the UI, right? They use policy as code. And another thing is that
Yep.
they love is that the errors are actually in line. So most of the time, people don't really have to go to app.datree.io, because all of the communication of the
Yep.
policy engine is done with admission controllers, with the CLI, in CI/CD, and this is what you should strive to. So this is another point in policies. And the final
Yep.
thing around also policies is that one thing is also to talk about custom policies. So custom rules
Yep.
is
Let's talk about that.
actually, yeah, let's talk about that. So let's say I want to make sure that all of my workloads have a label, I don't know, owner or app or cost center. So in order to do that, you can write a custom policy. And in our case, you can do it either by using a JSON schema or Rego. So here's an
Yep.
example. We're tech people, we love to see code and examples. So here I want to make sure that labels app is required. Want to set a minimum key for a specific kind. So you can say deployment needs to have a minimum of 3, because that's another best practice for resilience, to make sure that you have 3 replicas. And we can look at the same thing in Rego. So another best practice is, for example, you don't want to pull images from an unauthorized registry. Again, maybe you're like
Yep.
copy pasting something from the internet, and guess what?
Yep.
There's an attack called typo squatting, where instead of getting node, you're getting mode because you misclicked M and N, and then oops,
Right.
too bad. So that's the way to do it. And you can run custom policies, so you can actually codify the entire workloads in your company with custom policies that will be managed via GitOps.
Yep.
One thing that I wanted to touch
Yep.
on
And this is
is,
so important.
yes,
Yep.
I wanted to touch upon a Cedar. It's too many security, too many security
Right. So that would
companies.
be
And I think I'm miswriting it.
CEDAR policy, cedarpolicy.com.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Policy. Yeah. So I showed you JSON
Yep. There you
schema.
go.
I showed you Rego. Here's the open source, fast, scalable access control, which is, it is interesting
Yep.
because OPA has a lot of people using Rego and the use case of validating configuration, but people also use it for
Exactly.
authorization. So it is also very very cool, and I recommend you check it out. It's fairly new, so
Yep.
maybe not everything supports it, but it's a really cool policy engine that AWS released. But most of the use
Yep.
cases are for RBAC and ABAC use cases.
Yep. And again, that's important, right? Because earlier on we were talking about the API request path and where your admission controls fit in, but also part of that API request path is also where your authorization modules fit in, access control. And whether, like you said, whether it's role-based access control or attribute-based access control, that's a different aspect of that API request path. And so this is another area where you can use policy as code to secure that specific domain.
Definitely. So we can stop sharing. I think that like if we look at it going forward, if I would have told you, look, like 15 years
Yep.
ago, or I don't know, 20 years ago, everyone is going to have a server and it's going to be called the CI or CD server, and all it's going to do is build your code and ship it somewhere. You're going to be like, Shimon, you are crazy. I'm just compiling the code on my computer, putting it into a zip, and
Yep.
copying it or SCPing it to my server. But today, no one thinks in his right mind that this is the way to do it, right? Everyone uses like
Yep.
automated
Right.
build scripts and configuration. So the same thing here, like that's it. It is the era of policy as code. No organization is gonna be able to work without a policy as code, because this is like writing your amendments, right? This is writing what you can do, cannot do, and it is an API that is automatic. Because when I started Datree, I was an engineering manager of a platform engineering company. We had 1,000 employees, and one day,
Yep.
an engineer made a misconfiguration. Happens. I make mistakes all the time.
Mm.
And I tried to solve this issue
Yep.
in 2015 before all those tools were popular. And you have a meetup, you send emails, you tell them to follow this procedure of how to do things, but I
Yeah.
can't even remember it by myself. Like we have to do it with automation. So and I'm a big big believer in automation. So
Right.
I think that if you're working especially with cloud native
Absolutely.
tools and Kubernetes, you gotta have automated validations, and this is the way to go, because otherwise you're gonna find yourself with the Kubernetes cluster that you're afraid of, because you're gonna be
Right.
afraid of what's running there.
Yeah. Right. And I actually want to circle back to one of the features in Datree, the health score. So I think this is so important, especially for large organizations or companies and teams that have multi-tenant work or running clusters with multiple workloads, so multi-tenant models. because right away you get a quick idea of where you stand. It's like a quick report, and that prompts investigation. And then a follow-up feature to that would be being able to see the configurations per namespace. So I think that's, these two together, I think, are so important, because when you have multiple teams interacting with your cluster, that's when it starts to become a little difficult to control this, the security policies. And so they might seem like small features, but these are the summaries or the single panes that you want to be able to quickly give you a window into what's the status. I get my quick summary or health score. I see if we're on D. Why are we on D? Based on the namespaces, I look at these namespaces and I see, oh, okay, actually it's these particular namespaces. And you might find that they are associated with specific teams and their workloads. So now you already know which teams to go to say, there are a couple of issues here. And, at face value, you might think that that's not that important. But when you're trying to do things at scale, that's so crucial, because it saves you a lot of time and helps you quickly nip the specific issues in the bud. So do you mind just speaking a little bit more about maybe what you've even been seeing, how important those features are? Have you got any feedback from customers about, what they think about those particular components?
Yeah, so this is like going into policy management 300. So you start, usually our customers, they come in, it's open source for scanning, it's one cluster for free, so they run it on some pet cluster EKS, something that they made, and then they decide they want to implement it. And then you start with the implementation, and what we found out is that having one policy to rule them all, it doesn't exist. Like, it doesn't work. You can't have one policy for everything. And this is why we build support for, first of all, you can define any policy you want on any cluster. And second, you can define multiple policies per namespace. So what I see many companies do is that the centralized platform engineering, DevSecOps, DevOps, they call themselves in different names. They have like one like wide policy, which they try to make they try to make it as thin as possible. Like, don't allow privilege escalation because we're gonna be in real big trouble. But liveness probe and readiness probe, okay, that's important, but maybe that's more around the resilience of the app, or memory limit, sometimes more important, sometimes less, because if you have a noisy neighbor and someone puts some Java workload that takes 16 gigabytes of memory,
Right.
not the best thing ever. So what we see customers do is they have a two-layered approach. So they have like it's the same thing as, it's funny, 20 years ago in firewall. So there's like the catch-all, like final thin policy that the centralized team configures, and then every department configures their own policy on their namespaces. And I really love it because me and you, we are CNCF ambassadors. So I tell every company, create DevOps ambassadors inside of your company, and they will be from the engineering team. And those ambassadors, they will be responsible for their policy for their namespaces, and they will be responsible for talking to the centralized policy team, a centralized DevOps team, and to be the bridge between the applicative backend or whatever engineering teams to the centralized security teams.
Yeah, that's excellent. I'm a big believer in that, and I love the fact that you've even mentioned that. It's another way of extending your platform team or your security team, right? Because again, in reality, your application teams are going to be, you want them to focus on the application itself and responding to the quick changes that they have to be making. Velocity is their priority. But in the middle of that, going back to what we said earlier, you still want to make sure that they're working within guardrails. And that's not always easy to accomplish in a practical sense. We could talk about policy as code, but at the end of the day, these are teams made up of people. So you want to have a person there that, like you said, whether it's an ambassador or a champion from the platform, the central platform team, or maybe even part of the cloud security team, that's going to help walk through this and help enable them so that they're not impeded, or they don't see this as a hindrance for their objectives, and all of a sudden starts to become this, a better marriage, as it were, between your velocity and security.
Totally. Now, I'm a person that is very, very, it is very important for me to be frank and open. And I gotta tell you, so listen, we talked a lot about the carrot, helping developers and shifting
Yep.
left and giving you the tools to run in CLI and in CI, and helping you understand what is the problem, how to fix the problem, what to do. But at the end
Yeah.
of the day, after like a certain point, at the end of the day, we do see that teams go like, okay, listen, we've had like this phase of adjusting and everything. In 3 months, we're
Yeah.
going to enable policy enforcement on like
Yep.
those like super, super critical policies. And
Right.
we have an escalation policy. You can talk to us. We can like acknowledge and, allow things that to pass. But there is the stick. Why? Because when the stick comes, it actually enables the teams to go and remediate and to
Yep.
go and to understand what is important and not important. And one important thing to say in our platform, you can also say, let's freeze the situation and make sure it does not get worse. So you could say,
Yep.
active misconfigurations that we have on the cluster, we're not going to touch them. They're not going to be disabled or anything. But new
Yep.
ones are not going to be allowed.
Right.
And then
Yep.
at some point, the teams go like, okay, on this date and time, we enable enforcement and we're here for you. But it is almost a needed case.
Yep.
But I
Yep.
really feel comfortable when they do it,
Hmm.
with solutions and that the same way that the tree has. I have to tell you a
Yep.
funny story. Which really, really, it really encouraged me to build the me and my team to build a solution that is actually favorable with developers. Is I talked to one large enterprise customer, and he talked to me about the use case of pulling containers from an allowed registry. And I talked to him and he said, yeah, this specific one, currently
Yeah.
we took care of it. He wanted some other stuff as well. And I go like, how did you take care of it? And he goes like, oh, what we did is we disabled the centralized Docker registry in all of our firewalls. So no one can actually pull images from the internet, because we blocklisted the IP addresses of Docker Hub and all of the external registries
Yeah.
besides our own. And I'm like, man, that's like not the best way to do this. It's like to blocklist the IP addresses for.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, I want to
Man.
build
And
tools that actually enable them and are
one of
invited to
our
work.
final things I'd like for us to chat a little bit about. Yeah. Right. Is you know sort of like a monitoring mode and a strict mode, right? So your monitoring mode will still tell you what the issues are, but that strict mode, the enforcement is that hard stop, right? And that's still and you need both, right? You might find for certain environments, perhaps your prod environment is where you'd want to have that enforcement. So maybe if a team is trying to figure out what model would you say is a good one, any advice you can give around that? Would you say staging and prod? Ideally, you want to make sure that you have your enforcement enabled, and then perhaps for a dev environment, in order to still provide that velocity so that they're not hitting many blocks. It's just more of a monitoring mode. So the flags are still raised and you see the issues that exist that need to be remediated, but it's not a hard stop for the quick changes they're making. Any pointers on that?
Yeah, so that is absolutely an option. You can do that. It more comes down to like philosophy of like the GitOps way. So you might say I have a dev cluster, staging cluster, and main cluster, and then you can go and you could say I want it to be replicas
Yep.
of each other in terms of infrastructure, and only the applicative changes to take part. Um, you can
Yep.
have it on monitor and maybe on dev, But I do, like, personally, I think that staging should have blocking as well. I'll tell you why. Because you don't want to be surprised the minute before you go to production. Like, in my mind, like, this should be caught in your computer, and worst case, not in your computer, in your CI/CD. And then, like, after your
Right.
CI/CD, it should be like a very, very, very strange use case. And it's like, one case that one customer told me that they cube cuttled the wrong cluster. Happens. And this is why you need a block, because
Yeah. Yeah.
you can have all of the
Yep.
great
Right.
processes if someone has an override. And if you don't have an admission control or validating webhook that actually blocks things, guess what? People can just cube cuddle whatever they want. So it's
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Shimon, any final things that you want to touch on before we wrap it up?
yeah. So
Any particular issues that you want to highlight? Things you're excited about? You spoke a little bit about common expression language in Kubernetes. Do you want to touch a little bit about that?
Yeah, so if you can bring up my screen, so the future of policy management and Kubernetes, if we look at, we're now in, as you see this video, we're currently in 1.27. So
Right.
what happened is that common expression language is sort of the going to replace Rego in a way. That's like one of the goals that some people put, and it's the language is very much driven by Google, and it is easier, and some people say more suited for. I think it is easier for the use case of validating configuration. So that is number one. So there
Yeah.
are projects and policies that you can write in Cell, and it is easier to do it, and you can read like the philosophy of like why did it go there. And by changing the language, there is also a new API that has been. So here you can see in the official Kubernetes documentation, common expression language. And then there is a new, this is why I said in the beginning, like there's actually three webhooks. There's the validating admissions policies, which was introduced in 1.26, and now
Yeah.
in 1.27 it's already there. There's a great article by Armo. It's a great company, and in the official blog, Kubernetes validating policies. And this is actually an example of using
Yeah.
the new validation admission policy together with Cell. And it is nice because it is easier. There's less work with the webhook itself. And this is really, I believe, going to be the
Right.
future of validating misconfiguration. So this is something that I'm very excited about.
Excellent. Well, I certainly encourage people that are watching this session to check it out and get started with it. And hopefully there have been enough pointers and principles just to help you get a good overview and understanding of policy enforcement as a whole, why it's important, getting started with policy as code, how it helps you scale security controls in your different environments. And very, very important, you don't have to do this alone. Of course, I'd encourage you to enjoy the Kubernetes community. Check out our EKS best practices as well. Lots of great guides there, as Shimon pointed out. But also, you can get in touch with the man himself. Shimon, if people want to connect with you online, apart from your subscribing to your YouTube channel, how can they reach out to you to connect?
Yeah, so I think also in my YouTube channel, you can see there's my LinkedIn. That's the easiest part. You can come in, add me on LinkedIn, send me messages. I'm really trying to be very responsive, so feel
Yeah,
free. My Twitter will also be there, but it's easier on LinkedIn.
fantastic. That's great.
Thank you
And
so
for those
much
who
for
tuned in,
hosting me.
get started with Datree as well. It's a sweet way of, yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for joining the session. Once again, check out Datree. It lowers the barrier of entry for working with policy enforcement tools. Sometimes you might find that I don't know where to start because I don't know Rego. I don't know any other policy language. As Shimon pointed out and as he demonstrated, they're built-in rules with Datree that you can get started with over there. So depending on where you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your day or the rest of your evening. Thanks a lot for tuning into the session.
Thank you very
Goodbye.
much. Bye bye.